Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Foreign Entanglements. We are taking a bit of a break from the all Trump, all the time coverage that we have been doing for the last several episodes, which really goes back even to before Trump was elected president, but has certainly dominated the things we've talked about since the election. My name is Rob Farley. I'm a lecturer at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. And with me today is Christa Blackmon. Christa, could you introduce yourself for our audience?
Hi, my name is Christa Blackmon. I'm a media anthropologist, and I just graduated last year from the School of Oriental and African Studies in the Social Anthropology program, in their master's program. And so now I'm living here in London as a media anthropologist.
Right, and this is not our first transcontinental foreign entanglements, but we always love to be able to do these. So let's start off with. We're going to have a pretty wide-ranging conversation here. We're going to touch on science fiction. We're going to touch on some video games, and then maybe some other stuff about visual rhetoric. But could you describe your work for the audiences, just as a touchstone, and so we can move forward?
Sure. First, I'll talk about my dissertation. My dissertation was on digital video of oral histories of the Nakba online, the Nakba being the Palestinian refugee crisis of 1948. And so I like to look at digital media, and which is a very visual medium, but it's also an interactive medium. And how we as a society relate to it and how it affects us and how we affect it. So I do a lot of media analysis. I do a lot of social media work. I enjoy social media personally. I have a good experience with it, but I also pay attention to how we act on social media and how those actions affect us in real life. I call myself I just started calling myself a Twitter performance artist. Because I like to make a lot of jokes on Twitter and sort of highlight, the kind of absurdities that we all mutually engage in on Twitter. But also, I really like the genre of science fiction. I'm very interested in global fiction and how we relate to it. And I've been a science fiction fan for a long time, and I see a lot of confluence between science fiction and international relations.
The idea of a Twitter performance artist is actually fairly compelling to me, because I certainly feel myself playing. I'm active on a variety of different social media networks, as many of us are. I see myself playing a different persona, playing a different role on Twitter than I do on Facebook. And sometimes those persona interact with one another, and sometimes they interact with other persona in my life, like lecturer or father or anything along those lines. But there's definitely a performance aspect, right? There is, there's the I've always sort of had serious reservations about the entire concept of authenticity and the idea of these persona that we perform in some sense is compelling to me on the social networks, and that these roles that we have are different. So let's dive into the science fiction question, and to my understanding, your work revolves around this, or your work on science fiction. Some of the questions it revolves around, right? Sort of how do extant political circumstances construct the worlds that we envision for the future, and then how do those worlds feed back into our understanding of what we're doing right now? And so we're obviously in an interesting spot right now with respect to some of the major science fiction franchises, right? Star Wars has made a huge comeback. Star Trek is on a bit of a hiatus. But I guess just to sort of start things off, what are your thoughts on sort of where we are in terms of the politics of the moment and the politics of the future? Or the representation of the future.
Right. First, I want to start off, I need to show you my T-shirt that I'm wearing right now. So I'll have to stand up and move my hair a little. But if you can see it, it says, "Support non-human rights." And this is actually using a symbol from the film District 9. And I felt it was very appropriate that I wear that T-shirt for this talk. And So first I want to go into some kind of definition of terms. What is science fiction? Science fiction is a term that we created in mostly the English-speaking West that refers to stories of technology or stories of the future, and sort of offering an alternate reality. But we've tended to consider stories that don't have a technological component as part of science fiction. 1984 is considered science fiction, although it doesn't really have a technological component. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which is a futuristic tale of a dystopia, also like 1984, has no technological aspect to it. As well as The Hunger Games, there's very little technology to it. These are dystopias. And they are part of the science fiction genre. But also, when we look at other cultures, they understand the genre, even though they don't use the term science fiction. So if we start asking people around the world, what was the first science fiction story, you might get people saying the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a form of literature that is very familiar across all cultures, but we call it by different names.
Right. And I mean, science fiction in the Anglo-American context does sort of self-identifies its origins around Verne, Wells, right? Perhaps as far back as Shelley in some cases. But it does have this vision, even though it's sort of imposing a past upon itself in some ways, right? It's constructing an idea of where it came from. Around fiction that wasn't necessarily sort of self-consciously developed with the idea of science fiction.
Correct. And I went to a panel not long ago about did women invent science fiction here in London? And the answer was yes. Yes, they did. Because most people they won't go back to Verne, they'll go back to Shelley.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that there is a very important book by a Bangladeshi author called The Sultana's Dream, which was an alternate reality where women had all the power and the men were forced to stay indoors. So it was a flipped reality. Very interesting. Just goes to show that these things do exist in other cultures, and we're only starting to see them now in English, thanks to globalization. And when I talk about science fiction, I don't necessarily want to talk about the plots and the stories. I want to talk about the relationship that audiences have to science fiction. And I want to talk about the relationship that producers have to the genre, and the role that capitalism and mass production plays in creating these stories and broadcasting these stories. Because science fiction is now a mass media. It's a visual language, and it's global. Everywhere you go, it's dominated by Anglo-American stories, but the Japanese are definitely, breaking that hegemony, and more Japanese science fiction is becoming familiar to Americans. So you've got flows and counterflows, and you've also got a lot more diaspora populations getting involved in English-speaking science fiction and bringing their own cultural backgrounds and experiences as outsiders or as immigrants into science fiction. African Americans have been very active in science fiction and creating science fiction that speaks to their experience. Octavia Butler, who I don't think she was the first African American science fiction writer, but she was the first female African American science fiction writer. Her literature is taught in African American, literature studies, in American literature studies, particularly the novel Kindred, which is a time travel novel. So that's another example, time travel. It's not about the future. There's not a whole lot of technology involved in a time travel story necessarily, but it's about the future meeting with the past, and that's the novel Kindred. Some people like to include horror in the science fiction genre because of the monsters. Godzilla. Godzilla would be considered science fiction. A lot of Japanese and Korean horror films are becoming very, very popular among film fans, and they cross that barrier.
I mean, I've heard Stephen King is fond of making this argument, right? And a lot of King's work. A lot of King's work could very easily fit into the science fiction genre, but he's typically categorized as horror. He has wanted, for example, to drag the Alien franchise into horror rather than science fiction, right? That it's sort of it's incidental that it is placed in this technological future, but that really the language and rhetoric of the series is very firmly within the horror genre. And I have another question, which is actually bedeviled, and there is believe it or not, there is in the international relations subdiscipline of political science, there is a conversation about this question that has gone on repeatedly. It's and maybe you could touch on it, right? Is the Star Wars franchise actually science fiction, right? Or is it simply Lord of the Rings with updated technology, right? I mean, is it in fact something like Battlestar Galactica or Star Trek, which we firmly associate in the science fiction genres, or is it just really fantasy that happens to be in space, right? It's not even in the future, right? Star Wars is quite explicitly
right in the past, a long time ago.
Right. And so, one, do you have any thoughts on that? And two, does it matter whether we associate this franchise with the future or with science fiction or with fantasy?
I don't think it matters. And there is such a thing as science fantasy, that people, a genre that people have come up with, science fantasy. For my purposes, when I talk, I basically want to include anything that would show up at Comic-Con. And Comic-Con has started to include a lot of different kinds of genres, particularly for the purposes of their fan base. If there's a rabid fan base, they're at Comic-Con. They're invited to Comic-Con. So I think if there's a rabid fan base that starts dressing up as the characters, and that you can that they recognize as icons. If there's an iconicity to the fiction, then they end up at Comic-Con. Like the show Vikings, which is about Vikings, shows up at Comic-Con. It's a historical show, but people can dress up as Vikings. And so so we're going to let them into Comic-Con now.
Right, and it's worth. I mean, it's worth noting that sort of even the literature of what people think of as the golden age of science fiction, authors moved freely back and forth. Bradbury, Paul Anderson, Fritz Leiber moved freely back and forth between them. I mean, even Asimov, in some sense, who was the hardest science of a lot of these people, sort of smuggled magic in with psychohistory. Into the Foundation series, where suddenly you have sort of these magical psychologists who can make people believe things, right? And he tries to make that science, but it actually is fantasy.
And Ursula Le Guin, who I think is one of the very few science fiction writers who has been recognized by the literary community as a whole, and not just the genre-specific literary community. She was offered with a Lifetime Achievement at the National Book Awards. She would go in between science fiction and fantasy a lot, and also made a point of getting into children's literature. So these writers do oscillate back and forth. And another thing that I want to note is that these writers, these producers of science fiction, are political people. Particularly the writers, the television producers, somewhat, the movie producers, somewhat. They might become political afterwards. But the writers are definitely very political people. One of my favorite science fiction writers, Ian Banks, who created the Culture series, he wrote 2 novels in the Culture series as a direct response to what he saw during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. He's a Scottish writer, by the way. During what he saw during the first Gulf War, his novel Look to Windward, I believe, was dedicated to veterans of the Gulf War, and he was also very vocal about the 2003 invasion. He staged a protest where he went, I think it was in front of Downing Street, where he burned his passport to protest the Iraqi invasion. And he also got into the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement early on. He passed away in 2013, so he wasn't able to really tack on to the movement, but he was active in saying he did not want his literature to be in the Israeli market based on the oppression of the Palestinians.
So let's take that as sort of a starting off point. I know we don't want to dive into plot details, but just to start off with the Star Wars franchise, right? I mean, there have been a variety of interpretations of, the first trilogy is a way for Americans to restore themselves as the righteous underdog. The second trilogy is an explicit set of commentary on the Bush administration, right? Explicit often in very clumsy ways, but clearly an explicit commentary on the Bush administration. And now the third trilogy and what's happening to us right now seems to be confused, but also the scene of political conflict, right? The conversation about Force Awakens, the conversation about Rogue One, these were explicitly political conversations that we're having about these. So do you have any thoughts on sort of how this franchise has structured itself in terms of politics and because again, right, you're right, the writers and the producers and all of them are definitely thinking in political terms.
They definitely are, and so are the fans. And a lot of the producers are responding to what the fans are responding to. The original trilogy was never, I don't think it was ever meant to really be a political commentary. It was more, I've heard someone describe it as like a fairy tale for children, which is fine, but then throughout the decades, people started referencing Star Wars, the original trilogy, in their political commentary, because it was enjoyable to them. We were, back in the day, in the Bush administration years, we were joking that Dick Cheney was Darth Vader. Whenever he came on the TV, we'd start playing the Imperial March.
Well, there were memes associated because he had in 2004 he had the debate with John Edwards, and he would hold his fingers like this, and people were imagining that he was going to force choke John Edwards.
Right. So, Star Wars gave us this language that we in turn use to describe our current political climate. Whether or not it was intended to do that, probably not. But then when they started producing the new series, the second trilogy, like you said, was responding to the Bush administration, and lots of people over the years have reposted and repeated the meme, "This is how liberty dies," to thunderous applause, and I think that was probably the only politically relevant meme to come from that. To come from that series, as disappointing as it was to the fan base, but it became a recognized language. The new series is definitely, I think, The Force Awakens was responding to a different set of politics in its production, and that politics is the politics of representation, and the producers, since they sold to Disney, and I think this is to Disney's credit, Disney is definitely a corporation, a media corporation that is breaking new ground in media representation for gays, for religious minorities, for ethnic, for different ethnicities, because they want to be profitable. And Disney is proving that this diversity of representation can be profitable and enjoyable for everybody. So that's what I think was happening with the first Force Awakens. Rogue One accidentally became something different because when they were filming, I don't think they had any idea about Trump. And then when it was released, everyone who saw the film was definitely responding to what they saw in what was happening with Trump. And people were doing the same with Harry Potter when Trump was first elected. A lot of people it got blamed on millennials, but I don't think it was just millennials, were responding with, this is just like Voldemort, or, I'm not familiar with the Harry Potter universe, but I am familiar with people drawing those illusions and relationships. And a lot of, public intellectuals were sort of shaking their head and clutching their pearls, like, can we not make allusions to a children's literature? And I say yes, we should. They're not our only illusions, but these fictional universes are important to us. They're very personal to us, and the visual language that they use is becoming more mainstream, especially with Star Wars and Star Trek, and the Hunger Games, and the way that the media is mass producing these films and toys and all kinds of things. I pulled something up that I wanted to show you that I think is going to become a bigger deal in the months to come. So I was at the London Women's March, and I saw several signs that made use of this symbol right here.
Right.
And I happen to know what that symbol is because I have a friend who has it tattooed on himself. It's the symbol of the Jedi resistance in Star Wars, of the Rebel Alliance.
The Rebel Alliance,
yeah. And the signs that I saw it on weren't necessarily referencing Star Wars blatantly. But the symbol was popping up everywhere. And when I see people, doing #resistance, I see them adding that symbol in there. And I think that symbol is going to become more ubiquitous. And I try and tell people, it's like, that symbol is from Star Wars. And it's a long existing symbol. My friend who had this tattooed on himself had it well before it appeared in The Force Awakens. This is something from the extended canon. Yeah. This is deep, deep, deep fandom.
Well, and the Women's March also, and whether appropriated is a good or a bad word, right? I mean, they used Carrie Fisher in very explicit ways, right? She showed up in lots of the visuals. She showed up in, because of Rogue One, right? Rogue One, but also Force Awakens, right? That sort of this, the only figure in the Star Wars universe who is resilient and resistant to evil through the entire series, right? Is Carrie Fisher's character, and so she comes to represent it, especially for the Women's March. She comes to represent a particular focal point for this idea of resistance. Back to the Harry Potter.
And Carrie Fisher was also very vocal about that in her character. It wasn't just something that we took from the film. It was something that Carrie Fisher told us was present in her portrayal, which I think is notable.
Right, and I don't think very few have been suggesting that this was an inappropriate use of Carrie, right? Despite the fact she passed away. The Harry Potter comment is interesting. and some of the responses were simply that, I mean, people think in terms of Harry Potter because it is the only language that everyone speaks, right? And I can say that my children are in second grade. They've plowed through the first three books, and they're about to plow into the fourth one, and so they speak this language too, this language of Harry Potter. But, and again, I don't want to dive into plot details, but there have been some issues, some questions, I think some good questions about sort of the inappropriateness of the Voldemort comparison to where we are, right? And that in some ways, the Star Wars comparison is actually much more politically apt, because we are never given any sort of understanding of why Voldemort exists and why Voldemort has any. He is merely evil, and evil people follow him. When people are fighting against Voldemort, there's never this question of whether they have to make compromises on Muggle rights, like some group of people. I think Matt Iglesias may have mentioned this. The Dumbledore never needs to sit down with a coalition and say, listen, I understand that you don't believe in Muggle rights, but we do need you to fight Voldemort anyway, and so we'll have this. Whereas, the Sith notwithstanding, and the existence of the magical Sith notwithstanding, you understand why the Empire was attractive to people in Star Wars, right? I mean, the Republic is painted as a disaster in across the films, as a chaotic disaster. And so you understand Palpatine's appeal in a way that you then can sort of, with a language that you can then import into the real world, or export into the real world, to understand Trump's appeal, right? I can see a Trump figure in Snoke in the 8th movie or something like that. That would make sense in terms of, that would be politically legible in a way that maybe Harry Potter doesn't have the same kind of political, the legible political logic to it.
I have actually never gotten into Harry Potter. I don't have anything against Harry Potter. It makes me happy to see people making these kinds of connections to Harry Potter and feeling it so strongly. But I never got into it, which I found out is borderline illegal living in the UK. They take Harry Potter very seriously here. And you said a specific word, Muggle, which I believe is a term for non-magic users, which has crept into mainstream lingo. Me not being well versed with the Harry Potter world, I hear Muggle a lot, in just the way that people talk, and I recognize this word. So, an actual example of language coming into mainstream language. And you talk about, Voldemort and Palpatine as these villains, and I think it's an appropriate time to mention a very seminal work on media and fascism, media and the rise of fascism, by Robert Krakauer, a book called From Caligari to Hitler. And he wrote this book in 1947 as a response to what he saw in the German film industry, in the German film boom industry, and how Hitler came to power. And there are a lot of criticisms that you can make about his theory, but it's a theory with a lot of weight behind it. What happened in 1920s Germany, silent film was becoming a great big industry, and they were producing blockbusters, from what we would consider blockbusters, and a lot of these films had a very imaginative aspect to them. Metropolis, which I think is considered one of the first science fiction films, if not the first, huge hit. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a horror film. Mabuse, which is another horror film. M, which is not a silent film, but it was made by the same people, which is a thriller, a murder mystery thriller. Nosferatu, definitely Nosferatu, which is another horror film. They presented a certain set of villains and heroes that were a representation of what the popular psyche was at the time. You know, these villains that could hypnotize people. You know, like Nosferatu, could actually had that power. And how, you know, these mass productions of villains and heroes sort of gave rise to fascism and to characters like Hitler. And you can, you know, make the argument that that's what we've seen happen in America with Trump. We had Darth Vader and all the other, you know, Sith who literally could tell you to do something you didn't want to do, and you would have to do it. You know, that hypnotic power. Comic book villains like the Joker, Voldemort is a mass-produced villain. All kinds of villains and monsters and heroes. And who are these heroes? And how do they win? You know, that it didn't cause Trump, but it was reflective of a mentality that caused Trump. Right. So that would probably be Krakauer's thesis about mass media and science fiction in the age in this age.
Well, and perhaps even more than reflective of the mentality, right? It also offers a language in which it offers a language and a universe of meanings in which Trump is possible, right? Or in which Hitler was possible, in which Trump was possible, right? And I know we talked about this a bit, but I have been absolutely fascinated by, sort of in the wake of The Force Awakens, the most popular character. And he's a compelling character. I mean, he's probably the most compelling villain ever to be in the Star Wars universe, right? And in some ways, I think more compelling than Vader. Vader is this Kylo Ren figure. And, you know, the extent, and I hang around children a lot because I have kids, lots of kids dress up as Kylo Ren, right? Which is another way of saying lots of parents dress up their children as a genocidal maniac, right?
Right.
And lots of kids wear T-shirts that have Kylo Ren or that have the First Order. You know, right here. Here's my laptop. My children have put stickers of the First Order all over the back of my laptop, and this is an organization with explicit. Well, no, maybe not explicit, but clear implicit connections to fascism, right? It's a fascist organization. But the aesthetic of this, which is borrowed and is compelling in this space that we now find ourselves, which fascinates me. I find utterly fascinating.
Yeah, and there is something useful in dressing up as these villains. I think a lot of theorists have, you know, talked about, you know, doing it for Halloween as sort of like a cathartic exercise. You know, you dress up as a monster in order to sort of defang them. And, you know, we could go back and forth on those kinds of theories. But definitely part of the power of Darth Vader and Kylo Ren and other, you know, big movie villains is their iconicity. They're very visual symbols. And these visual symbols are not just restricted to America. These visual symbols are global now. You can have a conversation about these symbols with people from all over the world. They will probably have a different interpretation of it, but they understand the symbols. And particularly, they will use these symbols in popular discussion in order to get Western attention. There was a protest in Palestine a long time ago where people who were protesting the wall, the separation wall from entering their village or some kind of destruction by the IDF of their village, they dressed up as the aliens from Avatar. And, you know, it was a very deliberate choice on their part, and I felt really bad for them because Avatar is such a racist film. And I was like, oh no, why did you have to, you know, I understand why you chose it, but I'm so sorry that the film that you chose is awful. But they were using it in order to get our attention. Sort of throwing it in our face, like we are the Na'vi, we are the heroes here. Okay, recognize us. You don't understand anything about our country or our history, but if you can recognize us as the good aliens from Avatar. And we'll see this, people using that kind of language from around the world, trying to get our attention, casting themselves as the heroes in these kinds of scenarios. There were protests in Thailand where protesters were using the salute from the Hunger Games, which is three-finger salute, and it's a very overt reference to the Hunger Games. I'm not exactly sure what they thought it symbolized and what they did for it. Mohammed Morsi tried to justify himself through Planet of the Apes. He had an interview with someone, and he, without getting into details of the plot, he brought up the film Planet of the Apes, the original one, and he was trying to cast himself as
the
what
Charlton
he thought.
Heston, the Charlton Heston.
Yeah,
one?
the Charlton Heston. He tried to cast himself as the character that he thought was the good guy, which was very revealing. That he thought this particular character was the good guy, when the rest of us, we watch and we go, no, I don't think so. Bill Kristol, I think, will also write articles, or the Weekly Standard has written articles about Star Wars where they say, was destroying an entire planet so bad? Is Emperor Palpatine really wrong here?
Oh, there's definitely a pro-imperial. The Weekly Standard has done several pro-imperial, explicitly pro-imperial articles, right?
Yeah.
Alderaan was probably running weapons, and so
Yeah. So it's funny how we can all watch the same thing, and very revealing when we ask people, who do you think the hero is? And we create these stories and we watch these stories to tell ourselves, to sort of reinforce ideas about what reality is. We watch Star Wars because we want to see good triumph over evil. We want to see the fact that Darth Vader had a moment of redemption. This validates our worldview. So for someone to watch Star Wars and pick a completely different character to validate their worldview, it's very fascinating.
There are within the international relations strategic community, there are a large number of people who the character they identify with more than any other is Tarkin, is Grand Moff Tarkin, who is a sort of militaristic but also very strategic thinker, right? And so there are Twitter feeds devoted to Tarkin. There are blogs devoted to Tarkin, and in the new expanded universe, Tarkin actually does play a slightly larger role. So,
I also happen to know that to switch franchises a bit. I also happen to know that a lot of very, very progressive people are very much into Star Trek.
Right. I was going to switch to Star Trek next, so go ahead.
Yes, great. A lot of very progressive people are into Star Trek. I have a non-scientific theory that everyone who voted for Bernie is a huge Star Trek fan and voted for Bernie because they thought he would bring in the Federation, that he would cause that to happen. People that are very conscious of race relations, of gender relations, are very much into Star Trek. Immigrant diaspora populations, very into Star Trek. Well, they're also into Star Wars too, but lots of people see something in Star Trek. I have a Palestinian friend who watched DS9, Deep Space Nine, and he fell in love with it because he saw that it was representing Palestine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I see these memes pop up. They're a lot harder to understand, the Star Trek memes, because there's so many different plots happening that they don't reach as far. Star Trek is a very powerful franchise. It's a very profitable franchise.
Yeah, I'm wondering
that a lot of people understand.
Yeah, so how I wanted to think about Star Trek and what I wanted to bring up about Star Trek, right? Because we have on the one hand talked about how these franchises, these fictions, this imagery can enable certain politics, right? But obviously it goes the other way too, right? And so let me pose something and see what you feel about it, right? The 2001 Bush administration, right? Star Wars pivoted into the Bush administration with the prequel trilogy that was explicitly about that. Star Trek, with this sort of vision of the future that even sort of was being modified by DS9 and to some extent by the Next Generation, could not successfully adopt a language that made sense for the Bush administration, right? And they tried with Star Trek Enterprise. They tried to create a terrorist attack that then drove a war. It was awkward. It wasn't particularly well done. The series only really found itself when they had completely abandoned that. And that really the Star Trek series that captures the Bush administration is not a Star Trek series at all, but it's Battlestar Galactica, right? Which is in some ways the next Star Trek series, but that can't be a Star Trek series.
And Ronald D. Moore, who created the second second Battlestar Galactica. He was a Star Trek writer for Deep Space Nine.
He was the showrunner for DS9, yeah.
Right, yeah. So it was a very clear direction and how these things relate to each other. Yeah, definitely. The thing that I think really comes out with Star Trek and its impact on society is its vision of an economy. And its vision of global unity. And I have another friend who wrote a book called Trekonomics, which is all about how the economics of Star Trek has influenced modern economic thinking and vice versa. And for the viewers who aren't aware, Star Trek is a universe in which money is non-existent. Everything you want is provided to you by the government. Oh, okay. Had a break there.
It's a post-scarcity economy, is how I've heard.
Exactly, post-scarcity. Yeah, so who are we if we're not always in pursuit of resources of some kind? If we have all we want, if we have the shelter we want, if we have, if we can do any job we want, who are we? And that's also a question that is posed by Ian Banks in the Culture series. And his answer to that is we become imperialist dicks. Over and over in the Culture series is, the culture, that's what they call themselves, the culture, very imaginative, is a post-scarcity society, and they are bored. So what they do is they go around the universe and they sort of poke their finger in other civilizations and try and make them like them. Right. And that causes tension. And Ian Banks never really says whether or not the culture is in the right or the wrong. It's a very gray area. Whereas Star Trek, I see it as sort of pro-imperialism. Because it says, yes, we should poke our finger in all these places and make them like us. But of course, there's a lot of nuance to Star Trek.
Right. Yeah, there's a sort of, again, from the this may be, I don't know how science fiction people actually draw there, but there's a classic, it might have been in one of the Dangerous Visions books. I really don't remember. Story by Philip Jose Farmer called "Riders on the Purple Wage," which is about a post-scarcity economy in the same way. And the purple wage is somewhat akin to a UBI, a universal basic income. And his point in opposing the UBI is that and the purple wage created a true renaissance of the arts, a flowering of the arts that no one had ever seen, because 5% of the people were sort of suddenly enabled, and 95% of the people just couldn't care less about it at all, right? And they just played cards all the time, and it was just slothful, indolent whatever. But it was an interesting way of thinking about this post-scarcity future as well.
I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the impact that DS9 had, because it introduced the first black captain, who was the hero, Cisco. And this really makes a difference in society, the politics of representation. When Rogue One came out, I was seeing a lot of people from various ethnic backgrounds saying, I wish I had this when I was a kid. I wish I had someone that looked like me in this kind of blockbuster when I was a kid. There was an article a while ago, before the new Star Wars movie started being Disney, by Harun Mogul. And I remember this very vividly. He was begging J.J. Abrams to introduce a Muslim character into Star Wars or Star Trek. And I thought, that's very interesting that you think the key to sort of popular acceptance of Muslims is through geek culture. Is through this imaginative culture. And I totally agree with him. Yeah, have a Muslim character.
I don't know how that works in the Star Trek universe, right? One would have to, or no, the Star Wars universe. It clearly works in the Star Trek universe. Right.
But I mean, they had clearly Brooklyn Jews in the Star Wars in the Star Wars universe. With Brooklyn Jewish accents. So, you could have someone that's just named Muhammad.
Right.
In the Star Wars universe, and just not explain it. His name is Muhammad. It's no different than Luke, which is also a chapter in the Bible.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, this is very important to people. It's very important to people all over the world to see themselves represented in these mass-produced science fiction universes, because it's also an affirmation that they are a part of the future. And there was a whole movement, artistic movement in the 70s called Afrofuturism, which is not just an American movement. I think it crossed a couple borders, where African Americans were sort of casting themselves as aliens and sort of putting futuristic imagery alongside traditional African imagery. For some reason, they chose pharaonic icons and the pyramids and the Sphinx and hieroglyphics, and they were mixing them with like space helmets and putting black astronauts. There was a jazz musician or a funk musician. I think he was a funk musician, called himself Sun Ra, and he would go around telling people that he was born on a different planet. And it's kind of brilliant when you think about it, because in his era, he didn't actually have any papers to prove where he was born. So yeah, why not a different planet? So, and it was just an affirmation that they saw themselves as part of the future, and that we had to recognize them as part of the future. And there's a visual artist, a Palestinian visual artist, who's doing the same thing. Her name is Larissa Sansour, and she created this visual that's gone a little bit viral, of the Palestinian flag being planted on the moon. And it's a short, it's only a couple minutes long, but it takes the soundtrack from 2001: Space Odyssey and gives it a very Arab sound. Like with the sitar and with the ululation, and planting the Palestinian flag on the moon, saying we are a part of the future. Our identity is part of the future. We're not going anywhere.
Well, and we're seeing sort of there is a Disneyfication of some of the stuff that's been, or of part of this era, right, in the Black Panther, right, that Disney has sort of embraced the Black Panther, and Black Panther gets his own movie, and Black Panther, as we know, Black Panther emerges, in the Marvel universe around this time with some of these same themes feeding in. So, but it's also a sort of a monetization of it, and it's a capitalization, capitalism, not just having a capital letter in front. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention someone else in this, Walida Imarisha. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right because I only ever read it. But she produced an anthology of science fiction for social justice. And it has a very particular African-American theme to it. She was also part of a conference called Ferguson to the Future, which was all about science fiction and imagining the future. Ferguson referencing the protests that happened, the Black Lives Matter protests that happened, brutality. And, she envisions a world where science fiction becomes important in policymaking. And this is something that a lot of other people also recognize. She in particular recognizes it in the African American ethnic minority context. There's a genre. I don't know the term post-colonial sort of seems to drop in and out of fashion.
Right.
But there is such a thing as post-colonial sci-fi. Nalo Hopkinson, Nnedi Okorafor, who are Caribbean, African and Afro-Caribbean, respectively, producing something called post-colonial sci-fi in the written form. Saladin Ahmed, who he writes short stories. He writes sci-fi short stories, but he's more well known for fantasy. He's a member of the diaspora, of the Arab Muslim diaspora. He writes fantasy with a very clear Muslim view. I don't want to say Muslim view, but his fantasy could take place in the Ottoman Empire. And it uses a lot of traditional monsters and creatures that existed in all these cultures, in Persian culture and Arab culture and Turkish culture. All these creatures in South Asian, all these fables are introduced into his novels. And to get back into our discussion of what is sci-fi, some people will tell you that the 1001 Nights is also a form of science fiction. So I'm mentioning all these things because I don't want us to be talking about white Anglo-American sci-fi. I want us to recognize that this is a global trend, and I've only scratched the surface of it. I only know what's in English, but these things are coming more into the English market, and I think it's a great trend.
Yeah, no, and sort of the moves that we have discussed, sort of with respect to these big traditional franchises, the moves towards inclusion are meaningful and they are relevant, right? Cisco is relevant, right? And Ray is relevant. And Lando, in his own way, is relevant, right? It is different than a true post-colonial sci-fi, right? It generated by, sort of true post-colonial people, and it's different than sort of genuine visions of the future that aren't based, like so much science fiction is, around a 19th century vision of imperialism, right? And so, the inclusion is meaningful and important, and the sort of the genuine introduction of, different viewpoints is also meaningful and important.
Right, and when an interesting thing that I've noticed in non-Western science fiction, I just read a book called Iraq 100, which is an anthology. It's a science fiction anthology of Iraqis in exile, envisioning Iraq 100 years after the U.S. invasion. Non-Western science fiction starts with the idea that humans determine technology and how that technology impacts culture. Whereas traditionally in Western science fiction, we start with the idea that technology determines our culture.
Right.
which is what you see in Minority Report, what you see in Asimov, what you see in a whole host of science fiction stories about space travel. That space travel is what determines how our society is made up, but the societies that have been impacted by Western colonialism and imperialism think the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really fascinating, and I really want to see more of that kind of philosophical idea in modern science fiction.
It would be very interesting, and we're almost out of time. It would be very interesting for me. I mean, way back when you mentioned Japanese science fiction, right? It would be very interesting for me to sort of take that concept and then plow into Japanese science fiction, right? Because Japan is non-Western and Japan is Western, right? And so, and Japanese science fiction is deeply complicated and conflicted over these questions. So, but sadly, we're actually pretty much out of time. So, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Foreign Entanglements viewers, for joining us as well. But thank you for joining us, Christa.
All right, thank you.
And hopefully we can do it again sometime. And
yeah, cool. Yeah. Next time we'll talk about video games.
We were going to talk about video games, and we didn't get to it. So next time. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Great. All right. Thanks.